Hello and welcome, my friends, to the first episode of our new series for this week that I'm calling The Scarcity Trap: How Poverty Rewires the Mind. I'm your host, Danny, and over the next 5 episodes, we're going on a journey together. It's a journey into one of the most misunderstood, most judged, and most profoundly human experiences on the planet. We're talking about the state of being poor. But we're not going to be looking at it through the lens of economics or politics, well, not primarily anyway. We're going to look at it from the inside out. We're going to put on our psychologist hats and explore what the relentless condition of not having enough does to the most complex and powerful organ we have, our brain. I'm Danny, and this is a new episode from English Plus Podcast. I want to start today with a scene. It's one you've probably witnessed, or at least heard about. Maybe you were in line at a grocery store, and the person in front of you paid with food assistance vouchers. But you couldn't help but notice they had a brand new smartphone sitting on the counter. Or maybe you've seen a news story about a low-income family that has a large flat-screen TV in their living room. And if you're being honest with yourself, what was your first gut reaction? Now, for many of us, that reaction is a quiet internal question. It's a flicker of judgment that says, well, if they're struggling so much, why did they buy that? Wouldn't it be smarter to save that money? If they just made better choices, maybe they wouldn't be in that situation. That little voice, that question, that's where our journey begins today. Because for centuries, the dominant story our culture has told about poverty is that it's a story of personal failing. It's a story about bad choices, the lack of willpower, maybe even a character flaw. It's the myth of the bootstrap, the idea that anyone, regardless of their circumstances, can pull themselves up by their bootstraps if they just try hard enough. And if they don't, well, the fault lies with them. Today we're going to challenge that story. We're going to take that comfortable, easy narrative and hold it up to the light of science. We're going to ask a question that flips the whole script on its head. Are people poor because they make bad decisions? Or do they make bad decisions because they are poor? The answer to that question doesn't just change how we see poverty, it changes how we see other people and maybe even ourselves. Let's start talking about the judgment gaze. That idea that poverty is a consequence of individual behavior is everywhere. It's baked into our language. We talk about people wasting money or being irresponsible. We hear phrases like, they just need to learn how to budget, or the classic, if they just worked harder, and of course we give them a result. Now, it's a tempting narrative because it's simple. It creates a clear line between us and them. If poverty is the result of bad choices, then those of us who aren't poor can feel secure in the knowledge that we've made good choices. It validates our own hard work and our own position in life. It also, conveniently, relieves us of any collective responsibility. If the problem is individual, then the solution must be too. Just make better choices, problem solved. I have to admit, I felt that flicker of judgment myself. Years ago, I remember working with a community outreach program, and I met a young single mother who was incredibly stressed about making ends meet. She was behind on her rent, struggling to afford diapers, the whole 9 yards. A few weeks later, I saw her and her child at a local fair. And she had just bought her daughter a big, fluffy, overpriced stuffed animal. And for a split second, that voice in my head whispered, is that really the best use of her money right now? I caught myself, but the thought was there. It was automatic. Because that's the story I'd been taught my whole life. But what if that story is not just wrong, but dangerously wrong? What if it's a myth that prevents us from seeing the real problem? What if the central character in the story of poverty isn't the person at all? What if the main character is the condition, an invisible force that has a direct, measurable, and profound impact on our ability to think clearly. And now let's stop speculating and turn to the evidence. Let's leave the world of opinion and enter the world of science. Because a little over a decade ago, a group of researchers decided to test this very idea. They wanted to know if they could actually measure the effect of poverty on a person's brain power. Their laboratory wasn't a pristine university building. It was in the dusty, sun-baked fields of rural India. And their subjects weren't college students, they were sugarcane farmers. What they found would change our understanding of poverty forever. Now, my friends, let's take a trip to the sugarcane fields. Imagine you're a sugarcane farmer in the state of Tamil Nadu in southern India. Your life revolves around a single massive event, the annual harvest. Sugarcane is a crop that pays out just once a year. For a few months after you sell your harvest, you are relatively flush. You have money in your pocket, you can pay off debts, fix your roof, buy things your family needs, and maybe even save a little. Life isn't easy, but there's a cushion. But as the months wear on, that cushion disappears. The money dwindles. In the months leading up to the next harvest, things get desperate. You're taking out loans, pawning possessions, and constantly worrying about how you'll feed your family until the next payday. In 2013, a team of brilliant researchers saw something remarkable in this cycle. The farmers were the exact same people in the months after the harvest as they were in the months before it. Their education didn't change. Their skills didn't change. Their genetics didn't change. The only thing that changed was their financial condition. In June, they were poor. In October, they were rich, well, relatively speaking. This created a perfect natural experiment. The researchers could test the same person under conditions of scarcity and under conditions of plenty. So that's what they did. They went to these villages and gave the farmers two standard cognitive tests. The first was a test called Raven's Progressive Matrices. You've probably seen something like it before. You're shown a grid of geometric patterns with one piece missing, and you have to choose the correct missing piece from a set of options. It's a classic test of fluid intelligence, which is your ability to think logically and solve problems in novel situations, independent of any knowledge you've acquired. Well, it's kind of a measure of raw brain power. The second test was a cognitive control test. In this one, you're shown a shape, like a green square, and you have to press a key for the color green and ignore the shape, which is a square here. Then they'll switch it up and tell you to focus on the shape and ignore the color. Sounds simple, but it requires you to actively inhibit your natural first impulse. It's a measure of your self-control, your focus, your ability to resist distraction and stick to a goal. So the researchers tested 464 farmers twice. Once in the pre-harvest months, when they were struggling, and again in the post-harvest months, when they were comfortable. Same people, same tests, different financial circumstances. What do you think they found? The results were staggering. They weren't just a little bit different, they were dramatically different. In the pre-harvest period, when the farmers were poor, they performed significantly worse on both tests. They made more errors and they were slower. But how much worse? Well, let's put it in terms you and I can understand. The researchers found that the effect of poverty on their cognitive performance was equivalent to losing an entire night of sleep. Imagine pulling an all-nighter and then trying to take a difficult exam. That's the mental state the farmers were in and day out, simply because they were poor. Let me give you an even more shocking comparison. The drop in their performance on the fluid intelligence test was massive. The difference between their post-harvest scores and their pre-harvest scores was on average between 9 and 10 points. Now, to put that in perspective, in IQ terms, that's a drop of about 13 points. Let that sink in. A 13-point drop in IQ. That is the difference between being categorized as having average intelligence and borderline deficient. It's the difference between average and superior or borderline gifted. And this wasn't a permanent state. It was a temporary cognitive deficit imposed entirely by their financial circumstances. This was a bombshell discovery. It suggested that poverty wasn't just a lack of money, it was a lack of cognitive resources. It wasn't about the farmers being unintelligent. It was that poverty itself was making them function as if they were less intelligent. It was literally stealing their IQ points. And the question was, how? Now, my friends, let's talk about the bandwidth tax. Now, to understand what was happening to the minds of those farmers and what happens to the minds of millions of people around the world, we need to introduce the single most important concept in this entire series. It's an analogy that the researchers Mullinahan and Schaefer developed, those researchers I told you about before. And it is beautifully simple and very powerful. The concept is mental bandwidth. And think of your mind like a computer. Your conscious brain, your ability to focus, to make decisions, to learn new things, to control your impulses, that's your computer's RAM. We all have a finite amount of this mental bandwidth. And whatever is on your mind, whatever you're thinking about, uses up some of that bandwidth. Let's imagine your bandwidth on a typical day. You wake up, you have some bandwidth dedicated to getting the kids ready for school. A big chunk is reserved for your job, solving problems, writing emails, focusing on tasks. And you use some to plan what to make for dinner, some to remember to pay the phone bill. Maybe you dedicate a little to trying to learn a new language on your app, I don't know. Your mind is busy, for sure. You have multiple programs running. But for the most part, you have enough bandwidth to handle them all. A surprise problem, like a flat tire, might cause a spike in usage, but you can generally manage it. Because after all, that's a temporary problem, right? Now, imagine you're living in poverty. Your mental bandwidth is not a clean slate. Before you even open your eyes in the morning, a massive resource-hogging program is already running in the background. And that program is called scarcity. It's a program that never closes. It's constantly running calculations. I have $20 left. The gas tank is empty, but the baby needs formula. What do I do? The rent is due in 3 days, and I'm $100 short. If I don't pay, we get evicted. Where can I get $100? My tooth is throbbing in pain, but a visit to the dentist costs a week's worth of grocery. Can I just live with the pain? My boss cut my hours. How do I make the same amount of money stretch even further? My friends, these are not simple worries. They are complex, high-stakes, logistical, and mathematical puzzles that must be solved right now with no room for error. Failure is catastrophic. This constant churning mental effort is what the researchers call the bandwidth tax. It's a tax on your mind. Every moment spent worrying about how to pay the rent is a moment you can't spend helping your child with their homework. Every ounce of mental energy dedicated to stretching your food budget is energy you can't use to plan for your future or apply for a better job. Poverty doesn't just mean you have less money. It means you have less mind for everything else. And now think back to the sugarcane farmers. In the post-harvest months, that background scarcity program was shut down. Their debts were paid, there was food on the table, their minds were free. Their full cognitive capacity, their entire mental bandwidth was available to them when they took those tests. But in the pre-harvest months, that program was running at full power. Their minds were clogged with the constant, stressful calculus of survival. When they sat down to solve those pattern puzzles, a huge portion of their mental RAM was already taken. They had less mind to give. Their intelligence hadn't changed, but their available intelligence had been drastically reduced by the bandwidth tax. It wasn't a character flaw. It was a bandwidth problem. Well, this changes everything. It means that many of the behaviors we associate with poverty, like short-term thinking, difficulty with follow-through, what looks like poor decision-making, may not be the causes of poverty at all. They may be the consequences of a mind that is simply overloaded. When your brain is working overtime just to keep your head above water today, you literally don't have the mental space to think about next week, let alone next year. So let's go back to where we started. That person in the grocery store with the new smartphone. That family with a nice TV. Let's look at them again, not through the lens of judgment, but through the lens of bandwidth. Now first, let's get practical. In today's world, is a smartphone really a luxury? Now think about it. How do you apply for a job? Online. How do you do your banking? Often online. How does your child's school contact you with an emergency update? With a text message. How do you find the cheapest gas or compare grocery prices? With an app. Now, for many people, a smartphone isn't a toy. It's the single most important tool for survival in the modern economy. It's a lifeline. To not have one is to be cut off from the very opportunities that might help you escape poverty. But let's go deeper, to the psychology of it. Imagine the mental state we just described. The constant stress, the cognitive load, the feeling of being perpetually behind, the never-ending bandwidth tax. In that context, what does a purchase like a TV or a treat for your child represent? Is it a financially suboptimal decision? From a purely rational spreadsheet point of view, maybe. But we are not spreadsheets. We are human beings. In a life defined by no, a small yes can be a psychological necessity. In a world where you are constantly being reminded of what you don't have, having one nice thing can be a source of dignity, a way to feel normal. When you are drowning in the stress of making impossible trade-offs, an hour of watching a movie with your family isn't a waste of time. It's a desperately needed mental break. It's a moment of escape, a brief respite from the program of scarcity that is always running in your head. That mother at the fair buying her daughter a stuffed animal? Maybe in that moment she wasn't making a poor financial choice. Maybe she was making a rich parental one. Maybe she was buying her daughter a moment of joy in a life that had too little of it. Maybe she was trying to offset the stress she knew her child was feeling, even if the child couldn't articulate it. Maybe it was an act of rebellion against the crushing weight of her circumstances. Seen through this lens, these choices are no longer bad. They are coping mechanisms. They are attempts to manage an unmanageable cognitive and emotional burden. They are rational responses to the irrational situation that scarcity creates. The choice isn't the problem. The lack of choices is the problem. And my friends, this brings us to the end of our very first episode in this mini-series. But it's really just the beginning of our investigation. We started with a simple, judgmental question about bad choices, and we've ended up in a place that's far more complex and far more compassionate. We've learned that the narrative of personal failing is a myth. It confuses the symptoms with the disease. We've seen from the fields of India that the condition of scarcity isn't just a material hardship, it's a cognitive one. It imposes a massive bandwidth tax on the mind, draining our most precious resources, our ability to think, to focus, and to plan. It wasn't about the person, it was about the condition. Scarcity was stealing their IQ points. This made me wonder, if it can tax our ability to think, what else is it doing to the mind? What happens when that mental tax is levied not just once a year, like for the farmers, but every single day for years on end? How does it change the very way you see the world and navigate your choices? And that's where we're going next, my friends. In our next episode, we'll dive deeper into the daily experience of the bandwidth tax and explore a fascinating and powerful concept called tunneling, and how, when you're stuck in a tunnel, you can't see anything but the emergency right in front of you. Join me next time for the Scarcity Trap. Well, my friends, I hope you learned a thing or two, but don't forget, there's a lot more on our website, EnglishPlusPodcast.com, and also on the same topic. We're going to talk about poverty this week. And trust me, it's not the way you think poverty is. It's completely different. So stick around because there's a lot of content you need to know, both here on the podcast and on our website. With that being said, thank you very much for listening to this episode. Remember, if you want to support me and my podcast, you can do that by subscribing on Apple Podcasts or on Patreon. You can find the links in the description of the episode. Thank you very much for listening. Remember, never stop learning with English Plus Podcast. I'll see you again next time.